What would you do if you stood in a courtroom, fighting for justice, only to have a corrupt judge mock your faith and humiliate you in front of everyone? Yet somehow, your next words turned the entire case around and left even the judge speechless. That's exactly what happened to Karoline Leavitt in a small-town courtroom on the 10th hearing of a case that should have been decided long ago. A poor man's land had been stolen by a powerful mafia, and the judge, compromised by their influence, was dragging the case out. But when Karoline stood up, pointed to her cross necklace, and spoke words so powerful they shook the room, something incredible happened. Stay tuned to find out how she turned the tide and brought justice to a hopeless case. It was the 10th hearing, and the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Karoline Leavitt, a young woman known for her unwavering sense of justice, sat among the audience, her heart pounding as she watched the proceedings. The case was simple. A poor man named Daniel Harper had his small plot of land forcefully taken by a local mafia, a group with deep ties to the town's elite. Everyone knew it was an open and shut case. The evidence was clear, the witnesses were credible, and the law was on Daniel's side. Yet, here they were, months later, with no verdict in sight. The judge, a man named Judge Harold Grayson, had delayed the case again and again, always finding an excuse to push the hearing to another date. Whispers in the town claimed the mafia had the judge in their pocket, and it seemed those whispers were true. As Judge Grayson prepared to adjourn the hearing once more, Karoline couldn't take it anymore. She stood up, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom like a blade. "Your Honor," Karoline said, her tone firm but respectful, "this is the 10th hearing of an open and shut case. You are wasting the prestigious time of this court. It's our duty, by the faith we all hold, to do our work with complete justice. Justice delayed is justice denied." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. No one had ever dared to speak to Judge Grayson like that. The judge, a man known for his iron grip on his courtroom, froze for a moment, his face turning red with anger. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he pointed a trembling finger at Karoline. "You, Karoline Leavitt," he barked, his voice dripping with venom, "being the custodian of faith here, are going to decide what I should do and what I shouldn't? This is my court, and I will decide. And you, take that cross necklace off. This is my court, and wearing that you think you're running this place? Go somewhere else where you can do so." The audience gasped. Karoline's hand instinctively went to the small cross necklace she always wore, a symbol of her faith and a reminder of her late mother, who had taught her to stand up for what was right. The judge's words stung, but Karoline didn't flinch. She stood taller, her blue eyes locking onto Judge Grayson's with a fire that made even the seasoned judge pause. "Your Honor," Karoline said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet power, "this necklace isn't a symbol of authority over your court. It's a symbol of the values I hold dear, values I believe this court should uphold. Truth, justice, compassion. I'm not here to run your court, but I am here to remind you of the oath you took when you became a judge. You swore to uphold justice, not to bend it for those who can pay the highest price." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of papers from the clerk's desk. Judge Grayson's face twisted with fury, but before he could interrupt, Karoline continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "You mock my faith. But let me ask you this, Your Honor. What does your conscience say when you look at Daniel Harper? A man who has lost everything, his land, his livelihood, his hope, because of the greed of others and the delays of this court. 10 hearings, and still no justice. How many more will it take? How many more days will Daniel have to wait while the mafia tightens their grip on what's rightfully his? My faith teaches me to stand for the weak, to speak for the voiceless. What does your position teach you, Your Honor?" Judge Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in his long career, he was at a loss. Karoline's words had struck a chord deep within him, a place he had long buried under years of compromise and corruption. The audience watched in awe as Karoline took a step forward, her voice now softer but no less commanding. "I wear this cross not to challenge your authority, but to remind myself, and everyone in this room, of the higher authority we all answer to. Not the mafia, not money, not power, but the truth. The truth that Daniel Harper's land was stolen. The truth that the evidence has been clear from the first hearing. The truth that justice has been delayed for far too long. If my necklace offends you, then let it offend you. But let it also remind you of the duty you have to this court, to this town, and to the man sitting there, waiting for you to do what's right. Daniel Harper, who had been sitting quietly at the plaintiff's table, looked up at Karoline with tears in his eyes. He had almost given up hope after months of delays, but her words reignited a spark in him. The audience, too, was moved. Some whispered to each other, while others nodded in agreement, their respect for Karoline growing with every second. Judge Grayson, however, was still grappling with his emotions. Part of him wanted to lash out, to throw Karoline out of his courtroom and assert his dominance, but another part of him, a part he had suppressed for years, was stirring. Her words about his oath, about the truth, about justice, echoed in his mind. He thought back to the day he had first become a judge, full of ideals and a genuine desire to serve the law. What had happened to that man? When had he let himself become a pawn for the powerful? He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice quieter now, though still edged with frustration. "You are out of line. You do not get to lecture me on my duties. I have been a judge for longer than you've been alive. I know what justice is." "Then show it," Karoline replied, her voice unwavering. "Show it to Daniel. Show it to this courtroom. Show it to yourself. If you know what justice is, then deliver it. Not tomorrow, not at the 11th hearing. Now." The weight of her words hung in the air. Judge Grayson stared at her, his hand still pointing, but his resolve was crumbling. The audience held their breath, waiting to see what he would do. For a long moment, the judge said nothing. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand and sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Miss Leavitt," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper, "you have made your point, but I will not be dictated to in my own courtroom. I will decide this case when I am ready." Karoline nodded, but she didn't sit down. She remained standing, her gaze never leaving the judge's. "I trust you'll do what's right, Your Honor," she said. "Not for me, not for this courtroom, but for the man whose life depends on your decision." The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Grayson turned his attention to the case files in front of him. He flipped through the pages, though he had seen them all before. The evidence was clear. The mafia had forged documents to claim Daniel's land, and multiple witnesses had testified to seeing the mafia's men threaten Daniel and his family. There was no doubt about the truth. The only question was whether the judge would finally act on it. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The audience began to murmur again, wondering if the judge would delay the case once more. Daniel clutched his hands together, his knuckles white, as he waited for the verdict. Karoline finally sat down, but her presence still loomed large in the room. Her words had shifted something, not just in the judge, but in everyone who had heard them. Finally, Judge Grayson looked up. His face was pale, but there was a new determination in his eyes. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing the arguments presented," he began, "I find that the plaintiff, Daniel Harper, has provided sufficient proof that his land was wrongfully taken by the defendants. The court rules in favor of Mr. Harper. The land is to be returned to him immediately, and the defendants will be held accountable for their actions under the law." A collective gasp rose from the audience, followed by a wave of applause. Daniel Harper let out a sob of relief, burying his face in his hands as the weight of months of despair lifted from his shoulders. The mafia representatives, who had been sitting smugly in the back of the courtroom, exchanged panicked glances, realizing their influence had finally failed them. Karoline sat quietly, her expression calm but her heart racing. She had done it. Her words, her courage, her faith, They had broken through the judge's walls and brought justice to a man who had nearly lost everything. The audience turned to her, their faces filled with admiration and gratitude. Even those who had doubted her at first now saw her in a new light. Judge Grayson, however, wasn't finished. He looked at Karoline, his expression a mix of begrudging respect and lingering frustration. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice softer now, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to mock your faith and your necklace. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, something I should never have let myself forget. This court is a place of justice, and I failed to uphold that today. Until you spoke." Karoline nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply. "I only did what I felt was right." The judge gave a small nod, then banged his gavel to officially close the hearing. As the courtroom began to empty, people approached Karoline, thanking her for her bravery. Daniel Harper was the last to come to her, his eyes still wet with tears. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice trembling, "I don't know how to thank you. I thought I'd lost everything. But you gave me my life back." Karoline smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Harper," she said. "I did what any of us should do, stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." As Daniel walked away, Karoline touched her cross necklace, thinking of her mother and the lessons she had taught her. She had come to the courtroom that day as a witness, but she had left as a beacon of hope for everyone who had seen her stand up to a corrupt judge and win. And so, a simple case that had been delayed for months was finally resolved, not because of new evidence or a brilliant legal argument, but because one woman had the courage to speak the truth, to remind a judge of his duty, and to show a courtroom what justice truly meant. Karoline Leavitt's words had not only won the case for Daniel Harper, but had also changed the heart of a judge who had long forgotten what it meant to serve the law.